Good morning. Over half of the book of John, the Gospel of John, is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life. So if you have a Bible where Jesus' words are in red letters, these are the red letter pages, all the way from John chapter 11 through John chapter 17. And for the next, then, couple of months, actually, we might take a break halfway through, I'm not sure. We're going to join Jesus in intimate dinner-time conversation with his closest friends. It's the Last Supper. And he will, as we will see, he will strip off his garments and wash the disciples' feet. But then after that, he will have a lot of things to say. And again, I think it's extremely significant. I think you'd agree with me that the opportunity to be able to hear what Jesus says, to follow along with what is on his mind during the last week of his life, during the last night of his existence, as he sits down and opens his heart to his closest, most intimate friends, we have the chance to be able to sit at the table with them and listen in and understand. It's a great opportunity, and that's what we're going to do. We'll listen to the dinner time conversation, and as we see, it will give us food for thought. Look what it says in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. The passage is written in the worship folder, and we're just going to walk our way through chapters 13 and 14 over the course of the next weeks. John chapter 13, and we'll look at verses 1 through 5 this morning. Here's what we read. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. We are told ahead of time what to look for in these pages. He now showed them the full extent of his love. It could mean one of two things. It could mean love to the max or love to the end. It could be the duration of his love or the intensity of his love. But either way, he now showed them the full extent of his love. And really what it's saying is, I love you this much. And then what we see then is an image of what love looks like. The point is, as we come to this place, they've walked around with him for 3 years. And if you think of, I wonder what that would have been like. You know, really, to walk around with the Son of God for 3 years it's been. What we know is that the first year and a half of Jesus' ministry, he spoke to multitudes. Then about a year and a quarter to a year and a half into his 3-year ministry, he selects 12. And what you find at that point, that he still deals with the crowds, but the disciples are always there now. He's intentionally zeroing in on them, and he's trying to convince them of something. So he speaks to the crowd, but then calls the disciples. They retreat to places, and he has more intimate dialogue. In fact, the closer to the end he gets, the more time he spends with his most intimate associates. And that's why the night before he dies, this is the group that he zeroes in on. And he wants to tell them things about himself, about love, about the Father. What he's going to end up saying and talking about is love becomes the linchpin of their relationship with him. And what he's going to tell them is, remain in my love. That's what he'll end up doing. He says, I'm going to go, and they, to some degree, understand it as the week progresses on. By this time, they know what's going to happen. Earlier in the week, he's talking about going. They said, what are you talking about? People are throwing palm branches, and they're lauding you. They want to make you king. And again, what we look at, humanity can be very fickle. No, that's why within the course of a week, a Palm Sunday can turn into a Good Friday within a week. And that's indeed what happens. So they know at this point that something is going to occur. And Jesus says, remain in my love. And you know what? When I think about it, of all the stuff, when you back way up from the Bible and try to get a sense for what really do we have here? Remain in my love has teeth only because they have experienced His love and want to stay in it. I think you'd agree with me. You cannot remain in a place that you have never been. You know, if I send you a letter, you live in South Dakota, remain in Arizona. You say, what? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. I'm not in Arizona. I wish I was in Arizona, but I'm not in Arizona. You can't remain in a place that you're not. And I think there's a sense for that. Jesus says, remain in my love. And the only reason why that has merit and substance is because they really do know they're loved by Him. And I think that's the bottom line, really, of their association with Him. Jesus said a lot of things, did a lot of things, but at this point, 3 years in, the thing that these people know, this guy loves me. And I want to stay in a place where I'm continuing to experience that. We form a mental representation of individuals. And the mental representation we form is very powerful, especially of our caregivers. The mental representation of mom and dad, loving, not loving, has an impact on us. And we make a mental representation of God as well. And that's something that we tend to adjust over the course of our lifetime. You know, maybe you grew up thinking that God is like this or God is like that. Some of us even made a distinction between Jesus and God the Father. You know, Jesus is approachable. God the Father, holy smokes. But Jesus comes to reflect the Father. And what He says, He who has seen me has seen the Father. So what that means for us is to the degree that Jesus reflects love, God the Father, it's not different. They're the same. He comes to straighten out their mental representation of God the Father and what He's like. And that works for us too, doesn't it? Again, it doesn't happen at once. And that's why it's important over time to continue to cultivate thoughts of God that are in line with what He actually is like. And we talk about God's love a lot because put your finger on the pulse of what God is like. That's what you're going to find. That's what we find in Jesus. And Jesus reflects the Father. So we're going to make room for a mental representation of God the Father. God is loving. We found a couple things then as we look at the depiction of love. We find the fruit of love and the root of love. The fruit of love. Again, what it says, and let's look again at verse 2. The evening meal was being served. The devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power and that He had come from the Father and was returning to God. So He got up from the meal, took off His outer clothing, wrapped a towel around His waist, and after that He poured water into a basin, began to wash His disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around Him. This is the fruit of love. Love manifests itself in serving others. This is what love looks like. We were talking with the kids. We might think love looks like a lot of things, you know, hearts or I love you. But when God paints a picture of what love is like, it's not sentimental and soft. It's servile. It's somebody serving another person. It's not primarily emotional. It's not grim commitment. What it is, it's the expression of someone who has time or talents or resources, bringing them to alleviate need. And even at the point of debasing him or herself to do so. That's what love looks like. Somebody secure enough, and again, if you can imagine, he strips off his outer garment. We'll look at a little bit of a clip next week when we're thinking of communion. Jesus takes off his outer garment, puts a towel around his waist, and debases himself, doing something that none of the others in the room really felt comfortable doing. You know, I'm not going to wash your feet because that says I am beneath you. Nobody's going to do that. You know, then Jesus ends up doing that, and he says, this is what love looks like. That's and he says that not just because he's God and he can do it. He's going to say this is an example of how he wants us to live. John is the one who would have been at Jesus' side. And it says that he and Jesus had something special. He would have lived then, we know he outlived the rest of the disciples by almost a generation. He lived far longer than the rest. The rest of them died off in the mid-1st century, and we think John lived until almost the end of the century. If you look, it says in 1 John 3:16 through 18, it's something that he never forgot. This is from a letter he wrote. John wrote the Gospel of John, in which all the red letters are, most of the red letters. And as well, he wrote some letters, 3 letters towards the end of his life, after he wrote the Gospel. Listen to what he says. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. The fruit of love is actions. That's what we find. Biblical love is more action than emotion. It's a verb, not a noun. It's not something that you fall into and fall out of. Love expresses itself not only in words, but in biblical love, in actions alleviating the need of someone. So if I have something that I need to perpetuate life, and you don't, if you lack food, if you lack shelter, if you lack something that you need to live, and I have that, it's not just material possessions, not just money. If I have the means whereby my life can be sustained and you don't, what the picture here is, to share that with you. That's the image. If anyone has that but closes off their heart, you know what it literally says? When it talks about has no pity, it's to close off the gut, to close off the intestines or the stomach. In their culture, they believed that natural desires, natural affections like love and fear, compassion, they came from the gut. It's kind of and so it says if anyone sees somebody but closes off the gut, steels himself, says, I'm just not going to feel. I think you've experienced that, haven't you? Where you see a need, and again, it's hard to know how to respond all the time. You know, if you're in a big city, and we in Tianjin in China, there were a lot of beggars in the street. And it was hard to know what to do. Some who had been there a long time said, no, don't, because they're only being put there by somebody who then, it's almost like a pimp, who puts these people in place, and the money that you give that person is not going to go to that person. It's going to go to this person who's running that person, so it was confusing. You know, you'd look at these individuals, and some of them had been just disfigured so that they would get more money. It's hard to know, but one thing that you end up doing is it ends up hitting you in the gut. You feel that? It's on the news. You might see somebody suffering on the news, and it's almost like you feel this thing inside. And what John is talking about is seeing that and stealing off. And you might ask, who in the world would do that? Back then, what was happening to the people that John was writing to, there was individuals that said they were so busy being spiritual, having spiritual experiences, having visions, and doing these things to try to get closer to God than others, that they didn't have any time to roll up their sleeves and be involved with people in practical expressions of love. That's what John is addressing. You know, gee, you know what? Look at that guy over there. I'm too busy. I'm too busy being spiritual. I'm too busy praying, too busy reading, too busy doing this thing that makes me closer to God. I really don't have time to do things like that. This is more important, to which John says, wait a time. Don't you really understand what God is like? God rolls up his sleeves. He doesn't distance himself from need. He dives into it. And that's really what we find, isn't it? Jesus could have been born anywhere. He was born into poverty, into a manger. God penetrates the planet, and he doesn't distance himself in the far away from the shouts and the dirt. He ends up going right into it and being born in it. That's what God does. God doesn't distance himself from trouble. Sometimes we think that if we have trouble, God is distant. And if we get over to God, then we don't... No, that's not really the way it is. It says actions. And again, what he's writing to, they felt like they were too spiritual to do actions. And then he talks about truth as well. Love is established on truth. So, this is the other side of the coin. There might be places that maybe misrepresent God. Maybe they say something like this. If you love somebody, God will love you a lot more. And so they try to generate loving actions and distort the truth in order to do so. And you might say, well, the end justifies the means. If you can get a bunch of people to be loving, doesn't that's okay, isn't it? So, and apparently not. We're supposed to love with actions and with truth. So if I tell you a bunch of stuff that really isn't the truth, but it gets you to be loving towards other people, that's not okay either. So we have to walk a line. Love is with actions and with truth. You know what? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time here, though, to tell you the truth. We could tell a lot of stories about love, and we could tell stories that would touch us emotionally. You'd feel it in your gut. That sense of, and maybe we could even set up things that we would do in group gatherings where we could love each other and we could sign love covenants. And I don't think any of this stuff would help us to do what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is not loving because he should love. And that's what that would appeal to, isn't it? You should be more loving. What we find here, Jesus doesn't love because he should. He loves because he could. He could love. He really can do this. He can stoop and wrap a towel around his waist, and even though the rest would be embarrassed to put themselves down before others, he can do that. How the heck can he do something like that? You could agree with me. The fear of being looked down upon on the human sphere, that keeps us from serving people. I'm not willing to put myself in a place where I'm looked down upon. We like to be looked up to. We don't like to be looked down upon. Remember Moses? Jesus. Seems like Jesus was able to do the things that he did. Well, it really says why he was able to do the things he did. Look what it says. And I'm looking at verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. I want you to, if you like to underline things or circle things, circle that. You know what that's telling us? Why Jesus could do the things he could do. How was he able to do that? And here's the answer. Again, we'll try to figure it out. The reason, because it says Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And so what that means then, the reason why Jesus could behave as he behaved is because of what he believed. And that's what we find biblically. When we believe the right things, to the degree that those things are deep within us and we really believe them, not just kind of. And this belief isn't generated quickly. But what we find here, Jesus believed that God had put all things under his hand, that he had come from God, was returning to God. That's why Jesus could do what he did. That's why he took off his outer garment. That's why he wrapped the towel around his waist. That's why he got down and washed the feet. Because he knew God has placed all things under my hand. I came from him, going to him. Who can I serve? There's a couple of beliefs there that were at the foundation of Jesus' behavior. And as we think of the fruit of love, we know what that looks like. But the root of love seems to be what we need to get at. And what we find, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. There was significance. Literally, that the Father had put all things under his hand, that he had been given responsibility and authority. You know what it seems like? he was able to live, even when people looked down on him, because of the sense of being elevated to a position of influence and responsibility in heaven. And that seems to be it. He knew that he had been given a mission and a call. And that sense of his call and mission was part of what enabled him to get up from the table, wrap a towel around his waist. And there was a sense of significance that came from, I've been given a role, a part to play in a thing that's very important. It says that people really want two things. And even when they invest in anything, they want to know that they belong. People want to know that they belong before they'll sign up. If it's a church or a school or anything, a business, they'll invest when they feel like they belong. But not just that they have a role to play. And when somebody knows that they belong and they have a role to play, then they're going to be able to invest themselves wholeheartedly. We need to feel like we're needed. We need to feel like we've been given responsibility and authority. That's what Jesus understood. And because he knew he was serving at God's request, that's part of what fueled his ability to serve. Chronicles of Narnia. There's a number of movies now on that, and it's about these kids who are regular kids in England, but when they get to Narnia, they are elevated. They are kings and queens, and they're involved in these noble pursuits. That's kind of what it's like. Jesus was able to serve on the world because he understands the authority and responsibility that had been given him from heaven. Again, the need to be looked up to on the human sphere keeps us from serving people. We find this Moses. Moses, if you look at a biblical figure next to Jesus, the one who had served to the greatest degree for the longest period of time, nobody can touch Jesus. Nobody descended from a higher to as low a place as Jesus did. There's a book by Bill Hybels, Descending into Greatness. No one descended as far into greatness as Jesus. But Moses, you got to give it to him, 40 years with a bunch of people who are whining and complaining all the time. How in the world could he do it? You know what it says biblically in Hebrews 11? He endured because he saw him who was invisible. That's what it says. He endured because he saw him who is invisible. He spent time with God, and that ability, that being with God, it ended up being the reason why he could serve. We tend to turn that around. You know what we do? We tend to try to serve people in order to get connected with God. We try to correct our behavior in order to get connected. And that's upside down. That's not what Jesus does, and that's not what Moses did. There's connection leads to the ability to do what he wants us to do. That's what we have with Moses. He endured because he saw him who was invisible. And because of this sense of connection with God, he was able to serve as long as he did. Do you remember what happened, though, when he struck the rock? Why did Moses strike the rock? What happened, if you know the story, it was 39 years in. He'd been walking around these people for 39 years, and they were always complaining, and I don't have enough food, and I don't like this food, and if we kind of put up our nose at them, we would have done exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. So he's in there for 39 years, and then it comes to the end of this 39th year that God asked him to do something. And then what he ends up doing is, rather than speaking to the rock, which God told him, speak to the rock and give water to these people, he ends up taking a big stick, and he ends up slamming the rock. To which God says, Moses, we need to have a discussion. You're not going to be able to go into the promised land. Why did he hit the rock? You know what I looked at that? I looked at all the times where the people were grumbling. And in those times prior to this specific one in the 39th year, God says to Moses, let me at him. I'm saying this is not the exact translation. I'm going to waste him. that's not what they're toast. And what Moses was, oh, no, God, don't. Okay, then that's what God would do. And here's what happened in this time. The people are complaining. And God comes, and He doesn't do the let me at them. He doesn't do their toast. What He says is, give them something to drink. Wait a minute, what happened to their toast and I stick up for them and then I become the hero? What happened? That didn't happen. Didn't happen. You know what I think happened? Moses felt overlooked. What about defending me? And so then, you know what ends up happening? He ends up going, and because he feels overlooked, what is he going to do? He'll take it out on the rock. Because he felt overlooked by God, he took it out on something else. I think that's why Moses hit the rock. We tend to look down on Moses, too. He was amazing. But there seems to be a point here. I think we need to see God looking at us. I think you need to see it. Not God looking at the person next to you. Really. Because they are in a way better place. God doesn't call people that are perfect. He calls people that are imperfect, and He says, not only do you belong, but I have a role for you. I have a role for you. I have a role for you. You say, how important is that? I think we need to see God looking at us. Because the sense that we are regarded by Him, what does that help us do? Helps kneel down, put the towel, wash the feet. Because the fact is, when you wash somebody's feet, they're not always going to go, oh, thank you so much. And you go, oh, it's nothing. Nothing. Oh, just doing my Christian thing. You know what they're going to do? They're going to say, about time. And if we draw our strength to serve from the way people look at us, we're going to end up hitting something. Angry. How dare they overlook me? Being overlooked is a tough thing. And that's why people who seem to have served long term, Jesus is the biggest one. He knew this. His connection with God was secure, and because of the security of that connection, that enabled him to serve. Not only significance that he had been given a role, but confidence. Again, it says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power, that He had come from God and was returning to God. Jesus knew where He came from and where He was going. He knew that He was returning to the Father, and He was living with a view to eternity. We spend a lot of time talking about the security of our connection. Maybe, perhaps it might seem like overdoing it, and we're not. It's the key to everything. And the reason why Jesus is able to serve is because He knows where He's come from and where He's going. And He doesn't just know it here. He knows it deep down because He's lived with it. This sense of connection is seminal. It's the essence. It's the heart. And you're like me. We don't get this right away. We don't buy this deep down. We kind of know it, but we kind of don't. But you know what? If you keep on thinking of it, making room in your head for it, not just God's commandments, His commitments, His commitments, His commitments. What ends up happening, the belief of that ends up drizzling down into you. And at some point, it might feel that you are grabbing these concepts, and they're so different from what you've grown to be able to hear, that they just kind of don't fit. Let me tell you what happens. In the beginning, it feels like you're grabbing these things and you're trying to keep them in your pocket. What did you just say, Mike? Say that again. After a while, here's what happens. Some of you know this. They start to grab you. You don't grab them anymore. They start to grab you, and you find that they're bringing your mindset into places where it more naturally becomes thoughts about His connection. Jesus didn't have to conjure these beliefs of His connection with the Father. They were there. That was the reason that He was able to serve why He served. Do you understand how deeply loved you are? And not just, oh, you're my little Wookums. We think of God's love as soft and sentimental. It is not. It is hard and firm, and it's action and it's love. He will not leave you on the battlefield alone. He won't. He can't. That's the kind of love it is. It's a marine love in a way, semper fi. He will not leave you on the battlefield. He will neither leave you nor forsake you. He will not drop his hands. That's what God's love feels like. And when we understand, you know what? I'm never going to be alone. Not now and not eternally. That becomes very powerful. There's a story. I'm just going to read it to you. Listen to this story. Jesus told his disciples a parable. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." A manager is somebody who manages another person's estate. This guy is not being deceitful, but mismanaging. He's not doing anything dishonest. He's just not honoring the master's values. And so here's what the master says. The master said to himself, "What shall I do now?" The manager said, because the master said, "You're not manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "Okay, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down, quickly, make it 4. Make it 400. You owes 800, cross 400 off." Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill, make it 8. Make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. It seems like it's rewarding being a shyster or a hustler. Again, what's the point? And maybe this is it. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. You know what I think it's saying? This guy, you know what this guy did right? He said, "Okay, here's the problem. I'm not going to be able to be in this house forever, so I need to think about the next place I'm going to live." Where are you going to be living in 100 years? You know what the master did? This manager did? He lived with a view to the time when he was going to move out of his present dwelling. You will not be living in that dwelling 100 years from now. I think that's the point. Live with a view to eternity. And you know what that means? Well, a number of things. Those who think about and cultivate. Now, I'm not saying be afraid. Well, look what it says. 1 John 4:16 through 18. 1 John, look what it says. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in him. In this way, love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. Again, I'm going to read that again. What do we do in order to be able to do the things we need to do now? It means that we really have to think about what's going to happen at the end. You might not be aware of this, but your view of where you're going to be eternally is impacting your ability to love now. You say, baloney. It is. You know what we tend to do? If we think that this world is really the place that we get our reward, you know what's going to happen? We're going to have a very difficult time giving anything away, because I'm going to need it for my life. And do you understand? And again, I'm not saying don't put stuff away. But what this manager and what Jesus did, he knew the reason why he could stoop and serve. This time tomorrow night, I'm going to be home. So I can stoop down now and I can wrap a towel around my waist. This time tomorrow night, I'm going to be smiled at and loved, and I know that I need to be here to serve you, to give you an example, but I can't wait to go home. Why does he think that? You know why? Because he knows the Father, and he can't wait to get back in his love. When Jesus thought of God the Father, he didn't think of law. He didn't think of stone tablets and justice and harshness. He's saying, I can't wait to get back to him. You're going to love God the Father. Not just God the Son. God the Son and God the Father, they're the same. Jesus reflects God. Prior to that, prophets and angels reflected God. But they only reflected as much as they knew. Angels bow to God. He is their master. And if you ask an angel, what's God like? Ooh, rules and commands. But you ask Jesus what God is like. And he says, let me tell you about my Father. What is God to you? Is he your master or is he your Father? If you're listening to Jesus, and if you understand what Jesus wants you to say, our Father in heaven. If you think you're going to face somebody who's going to look and say, gee, I tell you what, you really messed up. If you're not confident of the day of judgment because you're gazing at yourself, it's going to be hard for you to love to the degree that Jesus did. Again, none of us are Jesus. But to the degree you understand what God is really like, again, none of us wants to die. I'm not looking forward to the process. I don't want to struggle for breath. I don't want to feel cancer eat me up from the inside. I don't want it. But what I do know is on the far side of moving out, I'm really going to like where I get to. Because Jesus has reflected what he's like, and he is everything we've ever wanted. You're not going to feel, it's not going to be cold and dark there with him. It's not going to feel strange, and we won't feel distant. It will feel like, really, it'll feel like, this is what I've always looked for. And I think for some of us, what we'll do is you say, you know what, I never really understood that really what I wanted my whole life was this. This is what I've always looked for. Relationships that don't change. Somebody that loves me and I feel significant and confident. And that's what heaven's going to be like. What it says in that verse, there's no fear in love. We're going to sing a song. Close off. It says there's no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. You know why we don't love well? Because we don't believe we're loved. And so here's what I'd say. We're going to spend some time over the course of the next couple months. And we're going to sit with this. And we're going to sit with Jesus. And we're going to sit with the disciples. And we're going to listen. And we're going to put ourselves at that table. And what Jesus says to them, we're going to reply it to us. And you know what? We're going to come away knowing we are loved. And when we understand that a little more deeply, it'll sink down a little more deeply. To that degree, we will be better at loving others because we can love when we understand that we are loved. We're going to, if some of you have questions, you want to find out about finances, where they are, we'll answer some questions, tell you about some steps that we've taken to put ourselves on solid financial footing. If you care about that, just convene with us. It'll be informal. We'll have a couple reports, some question and answer, very informal. Somebody asked about child care, and we don't have that specifically. Bring them in with you because it's not going to feel that. It'll be more conversational. Okay, let me pray for us. Father, I guess I ask that as we get to sit at the table, and that might seem kind of dramatic, but really isn't. I'm really so grateful that you have caused your words to be preserved and recorded. What a miss that would have been, Jesus. As you're saying all these things that you understand, if they're not preserved and recorded, we can't be there. We can't, but we can, because they are recorded. And so in the coming weeks, I pray that we'd place ourselves there and we'd learn things about you and learn things about us that would cause your love to sink deep into our heart. And again, this takes time. It's not going to be a 2-month process. But it's like raindrops, and every little bit helps. We start to change our thoughts, thought by thought, by thought by thought. And our image, our mental representation of you becomes more in line with what you're actually like. And as that grabs us, we find a capacity to serve in a way that we couldn't before we understood how loved we are. It seems to be the way it works. So, would you help us as we want to learn that, so that we can be the sons and daughters, not slaves, the sons and daughters you would have us to be. In Jesus' name. Amen. Again, we'll meet at 12 o'clock. If you care about that, room 206. Otherwise, have a great day.